right. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, and a very good morning to all. On behalf of CADe, I would like to thank you, all of you, for joining and supporting our session. Let's hope we learn something new today on qualitative research. Before we start, I would just like to introduce our speaker for today. So Professor Dr. Abdul Latif Cross Abdullah is a professor with the Department of Professional Development and Continuing Education in the Faculty of Educational Studies. So recently, he has been given a new post, which is the head of the Youth and Community Wellbeing Laboratory for the Institute for Social Science Studies in IPSAS. Or IPSAS, yeah. And all this while, Professor Latif's current research will focuses on the role of youth-adult partnerships within the field of youth development and education. So he has been teaching and practicing qualitative research methods since he joined the faculty back in 2005. Yeah, so hopefully we will learn a lot of new things today, or at least refresh our ideas on qualitative research. So without further delay, I would like to pass the floor to Prof. Latif.
Okay, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and a very good morning to everyone. Thank you, Dr. Dalia and Kid, for inviting me today. We have a pretty ambitious plan and schedule, so I'm going to get started. My hope today is to, as the advertisement says, just an overview of qualitative research methods, with a particular focus on educational research, given that that's my background in terms of my area of expertise. So it's nice to see some familiar faces in the audience, or sort of see on the screen at least, and it's nice to see a lot of new names and faces. And I think the way this is going to work is we're going to sort of have a controlled situation where you're free to ask questions at any time. And I think Dr. Dalia will help me in sort of regulating those questions or comments. But I will try to answer them as we go, as long as time allows. Okay, so we only have 2 hours, and I have planned a sort of ambitious presentation in terms of content, but I think that we'll also have time to answer questions and concerns. I think qualitative research is a very topical approach designed to doing research, especially now, because we are all throughout the world, we're living through this current very strange time, unprecedented time of COVID-19 and the pandemic. And I think what's happening is that it's really impacting on people's experiences with the world, how they experience the world, how they understand the events that are occurring around them, and especially how they make meaning of what's happening to their lives. So many people are undergoing very difficult experiences, very traumatic experiences. People are losing loved ones. They're losing friends and colleagues. They're losing their livelihoods. They're dealing with serious health issues. All of these life events are deeply meaningful experiences. And qualitative research at its core is really about understanding in a deep and scientific way how people make meaning of their lives and their experiences. And so I think that makes qualitative research in the current era and the current time that we're living in very, very poignant. And I think the literature bears that out to some. We see a lot of studies now that are being released, especially on COVID-19, but more from the experiential perspective of COVID-19. Okay, so I think this is a very topical topic for KID to choose now, and I think that more people are going to be moving more into qualitative research because of this reason. So the objectives for today, as I mentioned, a bit ambitious. I hope I can do it in 2 hours. I'll try my best, but I may have to speed up a little bit at certain points. So I apologize for that. What I hope to achieve by the end today is to provide those who are probably less familiar with qualitative research a general overview of the method, and then a basic understanding of the major differences between qualitative and quantitative research designs or the approaches. And I think probably many of you who don't know or are less familiar with qualitative research, you're probably coming from a quantitative background. So knowing that, I just wanted to sort of juxtapose the two side by side, just so we can see how different they are. And then lastly, I just hope that the talk will sort of inspire a bit a desire to learn more about qualitative research and consider using it for your work, okay? We're always trying to recruit more and more people into the realm of qualitative research methods. So in trying to meet those three objectives, what I'm going to hopefully do is to give you first an overview of qualitative research, the worldview or the paradigm that goes along with it, and then some examples in terms of qualitative versus quantitative research. Again, just to show the differences, so it's clear on how they differ. And then just to hopefully take a few minutes to walk you through what qualitative data collection and analysis looks like, at least the basic idea, the basic concepts. And then I hope to leave you with a very brief sample study of qualitative research based on a real study that was done in our university. I think it's a very nice example, very clear example of how qualitative research is applied. And I hope to do that at the end, so you'll leave with that, okay? So that is the agenda for the next 2 hours, and let's hope and pray that I can do it. All right, so let's start with the overview of qualitative research. And I hate to start with definitions, because definitions tend to be dry and boring. Actually, I like to start with examples usually. But let me just start with this quote by two very famous qualitative researchers, Denzin and Lincoln, who said, "Qualitative researchers study things in their natural settings, attempting to make sense of or interpret phenomena in terms of the meanings people bring to them." Okay. So from that definition, what we can gather is that qualitative researchers do things very differently. We study social phenomena in their natural settings. And if this was my class, my graduate class, I would ask the students, what does natural settings mean? What does it mean to study things in their natural settings? Especially when we're talking about human beings. We're not talking about animals. We're not talking about plants, right? So what does it mean for a human being to be in its natural setting? Okay. Well, I mean, what all that means really is that we don't control for the environment that we're studying. We don't control for the study context. In other words, we try to understand how people's culture, how their social histories, how their race or ethnicity might actually affect the way that they perceive their situation. They may perceive a certain life event. Okay, so we try to do more research that's more embedded in the social world. All right, and from that we try to glean the different ways that people make meanings of their experience. Okay, so I've got, according to my screen, there's 171 people in this attending this talk right now. But if I asked each one of you, each 171 of you, what is it like to be in this course right now? I would get 171 different answers. Okay. That means that despite the fact that we're all going through a common experience, the way that each one of us interprets that experience, the way that each one of us experiences that and attributes meaning to that experience is going to be different. And so that is a certain worldview, a certain understanding of ontology, as we say, that influences how we conduct our research. Okay. So researching meaning, what gives you meaning? And that is really what qualitative researchers are after. What gives you meaning? Well, words and experiences don't contain inherent meanings. People give meaning to them, right? People give meaning to them. For example, if I throw out the word COVID-19, okay, that word is going to have a very different meaning for everyone, okay? If I am the owner of Top Glove Corporation in Malaysia, when I hear COVID-19, I think of profits, money. Or maybe if I'm the CEO of Pfizer, COVID-19 means opportunity. Okay. If I'm a young person, maybe 8 or 9 years old, who just lost both their parents to COVID-19, and I hear the word COVID-19, that word is going to have a very traumatic effect on me, right? The meaning is going to be quite different than the CEO of Pfizer. It's the same word. It's the same phenomenon, but the way it is understood, the way it is experienced is very different, right? So qualitative researchers, our goal is to really understand that, how different people understand and make meaning of their experiences. And meanings are not inherently the same across different people and different groups of people. Okay, so we want to understand human behavior. If we want to understand human behavior, we need to make sense of the meanings people attribute to their social world. And so here, I mean, in this sense, I think qualitative research is very respective of the human condition. What I mean by that is it acknowledges the fact that although we share many similarities, okay, I was born in America, I grew up in America, I've lived in Malaysia for 20 years, and I could give you a list of things that I would say are very similar between Malaysia and the US, and things that are very different in terms of Malaysia and the US, in terms of the way human beings conduct themselves in these two cultures, okay? But there are, of course, there are stark differences, and a lot of those differences have to do with the way that people interpret their social worlds. So we really want to understand that, because that can really help us to explain behavior. And most quantitative researchers, their work is really aimed at trying to predict behavior, explain behavior at a very descriptive level, explain patterns of behavior across large populations. Okay, but rarely are quantitative researchers able to really understand with any depth why people do what they do. Okay, what's driving them, what's motivating them to do what they do, and that's really where qualitative research, the strength of qualitative research lies. Okay, so here's a good example. This was a young person, a student, who wrote this on their exam. It says here, if I had 1 hour to live, I'd spend it in this class because it feels like an eternity. Okay, and I really hope that this is not your reaction to my talk today. Okay, if it is, I know that I will have failed. But the point here being that for this particular young person, their experience in the class is very dry, very boring, not very exciting, and not very stimulating. All right. Now, maybe another student in their comment said something totally different. If I had 1 hour to live, I'd spend it in this class because it is the most important class I've ever experienced, and I want to leave the world on a high note. Something like that. Could be a totally different experience. All right. So you see the MCQ questions there, and the little circles with the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. A lot of studies, they use these kind of scales, quantitative scales, to generate general patterns. But can we really understand what the young person is experiencing by all those 1, 2, 3, 4, 5s? We can't really. We can get a general kind of sense, but how they're, in their own words, how they're describing the meaning of that experience that they're having is really hard to do by using those little 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 scales. Okay, and that is really the point of qualitative research. So the nature of qualitative research as a method, in terms of its actual practices, it is the collection, analysis, and interpretation of comprehensive and narrative data in order to gain insights into a particular phenomenon of interest. What is narrative data? Well, narrative data is essentially storytelling. Okay, storytelling. What is so powerful about storytelling? Stories are a very, very insightful type of data. Okay, when you ask people to reminisce about their lives, those become what are called narratives. Okay, I don't mean stories like fictional stories. I don't mean storybook type of stories. I mean stories where people are narrating, they're describing events or episodes from their lives. Okay, and so often qualitative research data is in the form of these narratives, and narratives give a lot of insight. They give a lot of meaning. People are very descriptive when they talk about their lives, especially in a past event or episode. So for example, we have Merdeka coming up in Malaysia, and if we went and did some informal interviews with our nene or our ato or our pachi about what was it like during Merdeka. Tell me some stories about Merdeka. Was it a time of excitement? Was it a time of sort of anxiety, apprehensiveness? What was it like? Tell me about Merdeka, right? And I'm sure we could get some really, really interesting stories about the people that experienced Merdeka, right? And so from those narratives, we could generate some patterns, some kinds of sort of thematic overall understanding of how those people experienced Merdeka. And maybe they experienced it in many ways, but there might be some sort of similarities and patterns there that we can sort of generate. And that is what qualitative researchers do with narrative data. So qualitative research is very useful for answering questions about people, participants, and the context that they're living in, as opposed to the quantitative laboratory study where we try to control for everything in the environment. Because we just want to focus on that one phenomenon, that one activity, right? How does a child learn? By playing with a ball? Okay, this is like some kind of clinical psychology experiment. And they put them in a laboratory and they give them a ball. And they control for everything else. There's nothing else in the room, there's no people, and they just study this child and the ball. Okay, that is a very controlled type of experiment. Okay, and I'm not implying that one is better than the other. I'm just trying to explain that they're very different in how and why they study the way they do. So for us, we would rather, for qualitative researchers, we would look at that question very differently. We would, we would look at the child playing with the ball in its natural environment. So maybe the child playing with the ball in its house, and who are the people that it plays with, and how do they play with the child with the ball? What kind of games do they play with the ball? What times of day do they use the ball, right? Under what circumstances, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a very different type of study. And they tend to, not always, they tend to answer the what questions, the why questions, and the how questions. Okay. What are the reasons, okay, or what are the different factors involved with what time of day a child plays with a ball? Why do children play with balls at certain times of the day? How, in what ways do children, use balls to mitigate stress or something? Okay, for example. Okay, so those kinds of what questions, why questions that are going to reveal depth. They're going to help us to really understand the phenomenon in its context. So here's just a very brief example of a real qualitative study. The title of the study is called Sailing Stormy Seas, the illness experience of persons with Parkinson's disease. Okay. And this is quite common in qualitative research studies. They use what are called metaphors in their titles. Okay. And the reason is because sailing stormy seas gives us a feeling, right? Oh yeah, sailing stormy seas is not easy. It's very difficult, very challenging. Okay. And that is exactly what the researcher wants you to feel, because that is really the study finding. That is the finding of the study. That is the experience, okay, that the people who live with Parkinson's disease go through, right? So the metaphor, sailing the sea in the eye of the storm, is the overarching finding of the study, because it conveys that meaning of what it's like to live with Parkinson's disease. All right. So metaphor is a very common use, a very common rhetorical tool that's used in qualitative research studies. In terms of now, what does that all mean? Well, qualitative research is based on a constructivist ontology, okay? And as I just sort of alluded to, it posits the idea that there is no objective reality. There are subjectively experienced realities, and these are multiple. In other words, each of us experiencing this talk is experiencing it in a different manner. That equates to different or multiple realities. All right, and that's constructed by human beings. Okay, constructed by human beings who experience a phenomenon of interest and experience the same phenomenon differently. All right. Constructed here means all of us come from a different background. We all have different previous experiences. We all have different anxieties and fears and biases. We all have different types of education. All of those things help us to construct how we experience something. Okay. So if you were educated in China and you are now involved in this talk today, as opposed to someone who was educated in Nigeria or someone educated in Malaysia, the way you were educated is going to affect the way that you are experiencing this particular phenomenon. Okay. And in fact, I've had this experience many times in my graduate qualitative research classes because I have students from different countries. And they'll tell me that, based on the way that they were educated, in whatever country, this is something totally new for them. In our education system, we don't talk about this kind of thing, right? So that's going to have an impact. It's going to have an effect on the way that you are experiencing that phenomenon. Okay. So we talk about multiple constructed realities in qualitative research. And so we really want to appreciate the different ways that people experience reality and make meaning of those realities. Okay. So let's do an example. Can anybody? I think we can chat, right? I think in this talk, using Zoom, we can chat. So let me just ask anybody from the audience now. What do you see on your screen? What is that big white thing in the middle of the screen? Anybody want to tell me? I'm not looking at the chat box, so you may just have to.
It's a cotton bud.
A cotton bud. Okay, now I have my chat open. Okay. So I see some responses here. Let's see here. We have cotton bud, Q-tip, earbud. That's 3 different ones. Any others?
Glasses.
A what? A cotton bud on a white piece of paper. Okay. A cotton bud with a shadow. You're very descriptive. Yeah. Okay. A Q-tip. All right. Nasal swab. Okay. So that's 4. Tubular, 2 sides, ruler, thumb drive. Okay, very good. You're very observant as qualitative researchers. Stick matches. Okay, so we've got at least 4 or 5. Okay, thank you. We've got at least 4 or 5 different answers. It's just a cotton bud, a Q-tip. Well, which one is it? Is it a cotton swab? Is it a Q-tip? Is it a cotton bud? Is it an ear cleaner? And there was a few others in there I saw. It's just something we clean our ears with. Why are there so many different names for it? Is it a socially constructed phenomenon? For example, what is a Q-tip? A Q-tip is a brand name. In the US, we call it Q-tip. Why? Because for many, many, many years, the main company that produced this thing was, they called it a Q-tip. And so society adapted the name for this thing as a Q-tip. It's a socially constructed name. Those of you in Malaysia, I know most of you call it cotton bud, as far as I know. Okay, there's others call it cotton swab, and then some even call them ear cleaners, whatever they call them. There is a social construction behind something as simple as what we call this white thing that we clean our ears with. Okay, so what more for a rich, in-depth phenomenon experience that we undergo? Think about all the different levels of social construction that go into defining how we explain and explore those experiences. Okay, if there's so many different options and possibilities for something as simple as a cotton swab, imagine for an in-depth experience, multi-phase, multi-dimensional experience. Think of all the different social elements of social construction, inputs to social construction that go into that. Okay, and then you can really begin to appreciate why qualitative research is the way it is and what it's trying to do. All right, so when do we use quality? Well, we use qualitative research when we are after certain goals. So for example, we use qualitative research when we want to develop new hypotheses about something. Okay, so maybe there's a phenomenon out there in your field that's been studied to death. Let's think of one in education. My own experience, I've been sort of studying this idea of school engagement. School engagement is one of the most heavily researched topics in education. If you go into the literature on education, you'll find there's probably 10,000 articles about school engagement. Is there any way that we can actually develop new hypotheses? Well, there are, of course. I highly doubt that there's been many studies on school engagement in rural Papua New Guinea, for example. So maybe if I'm going into a school in rural, an elementary school in rural Papua New Guinea, where there's virtually no literature on school engagement, I know that I'm dealing with a very different type of culture, right? And so maybe it would make more sense if I went into that study using a qualitative design, because I am expecting that there may be new hypotheses that might come out of that study. Okay, so even phenomena that have been heavily studied in previous literature, we can use qualitative research to develop new hypotheses. If we are looking at it from a new perspective, we're looking at it from a different angle, then we can develop new hypotheses. Or if it's just something that has not been studied that much, okay, there's just a dearth, there's just not a lot of previous research on that topic, it's a good justification to use qualitative research, all right, for developing new hypotheses, okay? We don't test hypotheses in qualitative research, we develop new ones. Understand, when we want to really understand people's experiences, okay, we want to try to glean their feelings, their values, their perceptions that shape their behavior, okay? One of the hot topics now in the literature on education, of course, is students' experiences with online learning during COVID-19. And we see many studies that are looking at this now, okay? Many journals are having special issues on this topic. So there's been a huge outpouring of literature on trying to understand what all of us as students are experiencing in COVID-19 with online learning. So again, that's a very good use of qualitative research, is to really understand in depth, in context. And in fact, I'm working on a paper right now with a colleague in Indonesia, and she did a very big study on students' experiences during the pandemic and online learning. All right. Now, of course, she's looking at it from an Indonesian perspective, which we have not seen much in the literature so far. Okay. So to understand, okay, in a richer and a more deeper way. And then the third major use of qualitative research is when you just want to describe. You just want to capture the language and imagery people use to describe and relate to a phenomenon. Okay, descriptive studies, richly descriptive studies. Okay, not simply descriptive, but very richly descriptive. Okay, and if you go through the qualitative literature, you'll find many studies that take this approach. Okay, so people talking about their experiences, where the idea is to really let the participants speak in their own language, right, in their own words. And this is also a form of empowerment, right? When we do research that captures the voices of our research participants, and they are allowed, they're given space to explore and describe what they're going through in their own words. It's a very empowering type of research, and it's a very descriptive type of research. And so you'll see in the literature things like feminist theory, critical theory, participatory action research. They often use this approach because their goal is not merely to report on research findings, but it's also to empower people who have previously been disempowered. Okay, so marginalized communities, Aboriginal communities, racial minority communities. These types of studies, they will use very richly descriptive types of data to empower as well as to report. Okay, so these are three of the major uses of qualitative research. So if you are thinking about your own study and this is really, you think this is one of these three is the goal of what you'd like to do in your research, then you might want to consider using qualitative research. So what's the importance of exploring topics qualitatively? What does it do for us? What does it give us? Well, for one, it provides a lot of insight. Yeah. It provides insight, especially into complex phenomena, okay? And many of these phenomena are actually quite common, but they are complicated socially. For example, here's a very classic example I always use because someone actually did a PhD on this. What is the experience of hope? What is the experience of hope? I mean, for all of us right now, we could do a study on this because of people's perceptions during COVID-19. In fact, one of the things that I observe among my just close acquaintances, family members, is that people seem to be really losing hope. People are very pessimistic now. They are even when you get a little bit of good news, cases are dropping, or extreme severe cases are dropping, people it just means that they're not counting the cases, or people are really, it sounds like people are losing hope, and that's of course not a good thing. So if we really want to understand that phenomena, and it's complicated, there's a lot of reasons why people lose hope, right? There's a lot of factors that go into it. So if we wanted to study that, because we wanted to get insight into it, we could do that through qualitative research. When we want to provide concrete details about something to guide understanding in a particular setting, okay? So, we want to understand exactly, the different ways that an organization, for example, can improve communication, right? The finding of our study may be 7 core steps, okay? Which is a very practical type of study, from our, okay, I'll give you a very classic example. The 7 Habits of Highly Effective Leaders, one of the most famous books ever written in management. Everybody knows, Stephen Covey, and the 7 habits, the 7 habits. That's basically the result of a qualitative research study. Okay, he interviewed a whole bunch of very top leaders, and he just looked for those 7. He didn't look for 7. He looked for those patterns in his data that identified those 7 things. Okay, and he came up with the 7 habits, right? So it's a very concrete book. It's very practical, right? Because those 7 habits can easily be translated into our, you and I, in my life and your life, and we can implement them in our lives. So this is a very practical use of qualitative research to provide concrete details. Another important rationale for doing qualitative research is providing insight into local meanings. All right, so culturally relevant meanings. Okay, so you want to create a new instrument, a survey instrument for school engagement in Malaysian primary schools. There may be some differences in the Malaysian cultural context, and you want to capture those differences. So you're going to do a qualitative study it's going to allow you to capture those local meanings, culturally relevant meanings. Okay, and then you can go and develop your instrument. And then to develop a comparative understanding. All right, so qualitative research allows us to do comparative types of studies. We compare one organization with another. We compare one school with another school. We compare this leader with that leader, or we compare multiple organizations. We have 3 or 4 organizations, and we want to compare their practices. So qualitative research through different designs, such as case study or multiple case study, we can do comparative types of studies as well. And again, those are in-depth types of comparative studies. They're not superficial. They're looking at, again, how 2 different groups or 2 different individuals or a group of individuals, the different ways that they experience something. Okay, so there's still, you maintain that level of depth in terms of how you carry out the study, but it's comparative. So you get a really nice kind of juxtaposition between 2 different realities. Now, in qualitative research, as opposed to quantitative studies, where quantitative studies are mostly driven by hypotheses, okay, research questions are really what drive qualitative research. So what I always tell my students is, if you want to propose a study, in terms of your proposal, the first thing you want to come up with is good questions, good, big research questions, okay? And that will really guide you in how you carry out and design your study. So in a qualitative study, inquirers state research questions. They don't really usually refer to objectives. They certainly don't use hypotheses, because in a qualitative study, there's nothing for us to really test. Okay, we're in exploratory mode. Qualitative researchers are more in the exploratory mindset. So exploration means questions. We ask good questions. Okay, and typically those research questions are quite straightforward. They're not very lengthy. They're not very complex. They're usually quite straightforward. And the idea, what many scholars in qualitative research say, is that qualitative research is the art of asking simple questions, getting very complex and complicated answers, and then turning those into very straightforward results. Okay, so it's like Small, big, small. Okay. You start simple, you end simple, but in the middle, it's very messy. And that's the work of the researcher, is to make sense of all that mess, all that complexity that we get from our data, different types of data, rich data, textual data. We have to make sense of it. And that's the work of the researcher. But from the beginning to the end, it's quite straightforward. Ask simple questions, get simple answers, and all the mess in between. So a question such as, how do students use program development tools? It's a very straightforward question. But wow, when you think about it, students use these things in many different ways and for many different reasons. Okay, so you can even begin to see how complicated that question could get, right? And so that's the art of qualitative research, all right? But it starts with good questions, good questions. Basic characteristics. Let's look at the core characteristics of qualitative research, okay? As I mentioned, takes place in the natural setting, okay, not in the laboratory, okay? So we may go to the field and study people in the kampong. We may go to the village, we may go to the jungle, we may go to the park. A simple example, qualitative research study on the use of parks, public parks, So the researcher goes to the public park every day and sits there and observes what people do in the park. They observe their behavior in the park. They observe what kind of activities they do in the park. They even might do some interviews with people in the park. Oh, I see that you ran 7 laps today, and then, yesterday you ran 7 laps, and today I see that you're using the workout equipment. Would you, is there any reason? Do you have any kind of reason why you structure your activities that way? Okay, that kind of a study. So that takes place in the natural setting. We researchers in qualitative research, we go to the field. We go to where the phenomenon is taking place. We don't try to pull people out of the natural setting. All right. And for those reasons that I gave. Researcher systematically reflects on who he or she is in the inquiry and is sensitive to his or her personal biography and how it shapes the study. So something called reflexivity is very important in qualitative research, because in qualitative research, the research instrument is the researcher. You, the one conducting the study, is the research instrument. No surveys, no pre-validated this or the other. No, you're the one that asks the questions. You're the one that comes up with the questions. You're the one that interprets the responses. Okay, all that work is being done by you. So who are you to do that work? What is your relationship with that topic? What is your relationship with that sample? All those things can influence how you conduct the study, how you interpret your data, how you analyze your data. Okay, so it's very important. Reflexivity is a very important part of the qualitative research process, where you have to be sort of in touch and in tune and very honest, really, about how your personal biases, your personal assumptions that go into the study might affect how you carry out the study. Okay, and so there's ways of guarding against those things, techniques that we can use, but that element, that principle that the researcher impacts the study, okay, is a very important part of qualitative research. It's very unique to qualitative research. Researcher views social phenomena holistically, okay, and this is related to research being done in the natural setting, okay. So we view the research holistically. We're not so focused on any one thing, even if we're doing a phenomenological study, phenomenology, which is really the in-depth study of everyday experiences. And most of what we're doing is just interviewing people for these, really long, in-depth interviews. But we're still open. We're still keeping ourselves open that there may be other things affecting how that individual is experiencing something. So we really want to take a holistic view of our research topic. We don't want to be too focused. The researcher uses one or more strategies of inquiry, okay? So as I just mentioned, interviews, in-depth interviews, as most of you probably have heard, are one of the major ways of collecting data in qualitative research. But there are many others, okay? Especially now with online communication, social media, there's a lot of online methods of collecting data. And of course, those online methods, any qualitative research data whatever form it's in, it's always going to be in the form of text. So whether it's a Facebook page or an interview transcript, or you're observing something in person and you're taking notes about what you're viewing, it doesn't really matter. All the data is always converted into textual form. Qualitative researchers, we analyze our data in the form of text. We don't use numbers primarily, okay? So that means that whatever type of data you're using, it's always going to be converted into textual form, and then it will be analyzed accordingly, okay? And so that often means that we use multiple types of strategies, okay? So we may use interviews, we may combine that with observations, we may include Facebook observations, Facebook discussions, conversations, and so forth. So it often requires or includes a variety of different types of methods. Researchers use complex reasoning as multifaceted, iterative, and simultaneous, okay? Qualitative research is not a linear process the way quantitative research is. And what I mean by that is quantitative research, you propose your study, you do your literature review, you go out, you collect your data, you analyze your data, you report your results. It's very linear. There's no back and forth. There's no cyclical processes there. It's from A to Z and you just finish the process. Qualitative research is very different because in qualitative research, it's very iterative in the sense that qualitative data collection and data analysis go hand in hand and they inform one another. So it's a process of going back and forth, back and forth. We collect data, we analyze it. We collect more data, we analyze it. We collect data, we analyze it. We go back and we revisit our research questions. We revise our research questions. We collect more data, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, it's not a straightforward linear process. It's emergent rather than prefigured. Okay, so it's quite common in qualitative research studies for the study framework to change, for the process to change in the middle of the study. We may propose that we're going to do interviews and focus groups, okay, in our initial proposal. But when we get to the field, we realize that there's really no point in doing interviews and focus groups. So we do interviews, but we follow it up with observations, or we analyze documents instead. And we have effectively changed our research approach in the middle of the study. Okay, and that's common in qualitative research and it is expected. It is expected. Reason being, because when we go to the field, we're not exactly sure what we're going to find. Once you get into the field, things can change. They may not be exactly how you thought of them when you did your proposal. You didn't expect A, you didn't expect Z, you didn't expect D. Okay, and suddenly, oh my God, I have to change my research questions because the phenomenon is not what I thought it was. That happens in many qualitative research studies. Okay, and it's expected, it's understood. And we call that an emergent design rather than a prefigured or a priori design. It's emergent. It emerges as we collect more data. It is fundamentally interpretive. Okay, so the researcher, you are an interpreter of social meaning. So the data you get, you need to be an interpreter of it. Okay, that's an important qualitative aspect. Okay, so I'm just going to do some examples here and then we'll take some questions, I think. I'm sure there are some questions. Maybe, maybe not, I don't know. Anyway, let's proceed first and then at the end of, actually, no, this is part 2. Let me stop here. Dr. Dalia, are there any questions so far?
Yeah, we have one
okay.
in the chat box. How important is ethics in qualitative studies? Is there a necessity to develop a guideline?
Okay, thank you. Good question. It's a very good question, actually, because in qualitative research, ethics is of primary importance. It's very, very important. The reason being is because in a qualitative study, we interact very closely with our research participants. As opposed to most quantitative studies where you have limited interaction with your participants. Usually it's, if it's, okay, outside of COVID-19, a situation, you will go and you'll give a survey to people and you'll collect that survey and you'll never really see them again. Okay, so of course, yes, getting access to those people and ensuring that your survey questionnaire is not too intrusive and it's not touching on sensitive topics and so forth. So of course, there are ethical concerns in quantitative research, obviously. In qualitative research, however, we are spending extended periods of time with people in very I don't want to use the word, I don't want to use the word intimate, but in very, for the lack of a better word, intimate research engagement. In other words, multiple in-depth one-on-one interviews with people. In some cases, studying topics that can evoke emotional reactions. You know, for example, I had one PhD student who famously did a study on the spiritual experiences of those facing their, the spiritual experiences of terminally ill cancer patients. So she was interviewing and studying people who were basically facing death. And so it was a very emotionally traumatic study, because she would literally, every interview she would do, it would end up in, you know, there'd be a lot of crying and a lot of sharing. And, you know, so studies like that, you have to be very, very careful with ethics. So they require ethical approval, to say the least. They require of course, a review of your research, your interview guides, your interview questions that you're going to ask, and the protocols that you're going to use, and all the different techniques. So yeah, ethics in qualitative research is a very serious issue. And if you want to get published, if you want your papers to get published, those steps that you've taken to ensure the ethical integrity of the study have to be very clearly articulated in the paper. Okay, so very good question. And yes, a very important topic for qualitative research.
Okay, yeah, there are actually a few more questions coming in. Right, because you talk about observation data. So I mean, one of the questions is actually, you know, how do you basically, when it's online, right? Because most of the time now everything is done online. Yeah. So how do you grasp the non-verbal kind of a reaction that your interviewees have, you know, all this body language? So that can be, I guess, some of the limitations.
Yes, yes, absolutely. It is a limitation of doing online interviews. Of course, it's a great blessing that we have these technologies that we can continue with our research and actually do quasi or mediated face-to-face interviews, I should say. But yeah, that's a limitation. You can't really do much in terms of non-verbal body language. You can do a little bit, especially if it's some sort of major reaction, you know, if somebody just has a breakdown suddenly or something. That is something you can take note of course. But let's be clear. I want people to be clear, and this is a point of confusion for a lot of people. Observations are not that which takes place during an interview, okay? And I know a lot of students, they confuse this in their theses. They'll write that we did observations, and when they explain what they did, they just talk about, you know, observing non-verbal cues and stuff in their interviews. That's not observation as a method. Observation as a method is a separate method where you go to the field, to the setting, and you spend an extended period of time actually observing behavior, observing the phenomena, okay? It's not what takes place during an interview. Observing nonverbal cues in an interview is really just an aspect of doing interviews. It's doing good interviews where you're observant of what's happening during the interview and the different ways that people are reacting to your questions and so forth. So that's a separate thing. That's not actually observation as a method, okay? So just want to be clear about that.
Right. Okay. Got one question here. In one interview, I felt I could change the order of my interview questions to get the data I wanted. Is this a hallucination or is it possible?
Hallucination. I can't make any claims about hallucinations, but yeah, of course, qualitative research, the nice thing about it is that it allows you flexibility. So your interview guide is not a survey questionnaire. It is just a guide. And the idea is that you're trying to emit the kinds of data that you want to get, that you think is going to answer your research questions. So whatever order you ask your questions in is totally up to you. As long as you get the data, you get the result that you need to answer your research questions. And so it's quite common for quality researchers to be creative. And, you know, one interview, I think I'm going to try this time. You know, this didn't work so well last time. I think I'm going to try asking this question first. And yeah, of course, it encourages you to be creative and flexible. You know, but of course, at the end of the day, it's the quality of the data we want to get that matters most.
What else?
Anything else?
Okay. this is about a combination of both qualitative and quantitative study. So
Okay.
what is your opinion for qualitative study to actually be done as a follow-up on a quantitative?
Yeah, also known as mixed method. I'm assuming that you're referring to mixed method research. Okay, so if you're using what's called a sequential explanatory research design, you can combine the two into one study. So you would start off with a quantitative study, some kind of, well, it could be inferential, it could be descriptive, it doesn't really matter. It depends on what you're thinking, your rationale for how you've designed the study. But yes, you can start with a quantitative study, and then you can follow up that study with a qualitative study. And if you combine them into one inquiry, it's called mixed method design. But of course, there has to be a rationale for why you're combining them. So for example, what is the reason why you're conducting that research? What's specifically to achieve by carrying out the qualitative research after the quantitative? Okay, so that needs to be clear, has to be well thought out. Okay, sometimes it's to elaborate on the quantitative findings. It's to give them some context, right? So you found that, you know, emotional support among teachers leads to or predicts quantitatively CGPA. Okay, but we don't really know what emotional teacher support looks like in this particular school setting. So we're going to follow up with some interviews with teachers and students to really understand in what ways teachers emotionally support their students. Okay, that's just a very quick example of how that might be done. All right. So yeah, absolutely, you can do that kind of study. Sure.
I guess we can also do the vice versa, right? Because in some
Yeah.
quantitative, you start with the qualitative first.
That's right.
Then you move
Right.
from
So,
there.
yep. So that's a sequential exploratory mixed method design where you start with qualitative. And again, the same basic rationale is you are exploring, or maybe you want to create a new instrument, a survey instrument, and and then from those qualitative findings, you then test them quantitatively. So either you find existing instruments that reflect those qualitative findings, and then you test those instruments, or you create your own instrument from the qualitative findings, and you go and you test that quantitatively. So that's another very common method or approach to doing mixed method research.
Right. I guess I actually because there are a few more, but I just give you one more, and then
Okay.
perhaps you just continue.
Sure.
And then we go back to the questions.
Sure.
The last one that I just want to share would be: can we quantify the qualitative data? Is that unethical to quantify the qualitative?
Is it unethical? No, it's not unethical. But usually what determines whether a study is considered qualitative or quantitative, it's not the form of the data, actually. What determines whether a study is qualitative or quantitative is actually the way the data is analyzed. So if you convert your qualitative data into quantitative, if you quantify your qualitative data and then you analyze the data quantitatively and you report quantitative results, it's actually a quantitative study. It's not a qualitative study. Okay. But you can also do the same thing and analyze the data qualitatively, and that would make it a qualitative study. Okay, so it's not really the nature of the data, it's what you do with the data that determines whether it's a qualitative or quantitative study. Because there is a method called quantitative content analysis where they do that. They often they'll pull out qualitative from qualitative interviews, they'll pull out different phrases or different portions of the text, and they'll quantify them. They'll count them, give them frequencies, and then they will analyze that quantitatively. So that's called quantitative content analysis, even though it's based on originally qualitative data. Okay, so we have to know the difference. And there's also qualitative content analysis. So you can do it either way. Again, it depends on the questions and the objectives of the study.
All right. We stop there first, and then I'll go back later. So perhaps,
great.
yeah,
Thank you.
because otherwise it will be unending.
I know.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Dalia, and thank you for your questions, everyone. So part two, just quickly, just to give to what we just talked about, some examples. And I apologize for those of you who are not in education. These are mostly educational examples, but I think you'll get the gist of the example. So quantitative versus qualitative. And I apologize also for that title because it's not really versus. Like versus is like competition, like one is better than the other. And it's a big problem when people begin to think in terms of which one is better than the other, because neither is better than the other. They're used for different purposes. Think of them as different tools for answering different questions. All right. So you have certain research questions you're asking, the appropriate method is quantitative. You have other questions you're asking, the appropriate method is qualitative. So they're used for different purposes. So it's not as if one is better than the other. Okay, that's a total misnomer. So no one should think along those lines. All right, but they have very different characteristics. So quantitative studies typically are considered objective, and I say objective in quotes because in reality, there's no such thing as an objective study when you really look at it. But they are objective in terms of the goal and the assumptions going into the study is that you're trying to get some kind of objective result. And quantitative review is done early on, and only early on, unless maybe you do some additional literature review when you get your findings and you're going to go write up your discussion section, you'll have to do a secondary literature review. But for the most part, the bulk of the literature review is done early on in the study. Okay. Quantitative studies tend to be theory testing, which is why they have often a conceptual framework, and that framework gets tested using quantitative methods. The analysis is in the form of numbers, as we all know. And they use instruments. They use mostly survey questionnaires or some kind of observational, these observational, not surveys, they're observational checklists and stuff like that. Whatever the instrument is, it's in the form of quantitative data. Okay, so they use quantitative instruments. And the goal ultimately is to generalize, which is why we have our sample size. We have a random sampling. We have G power and all those things, right? Because we're trying to, ultimately, the goal is to generalize our findings across a larger population. Okay, so we take a sample and we try to generalize it to the larger population. So the basic characteristics of quantitative research. Now, as you'll see, qualitative research is in some ways the complete opposite. We acknowledge subjectivity in qualitative research, not only on the part of the researcher, but also on the part of the research participants. In other words, we're studying their subjective views of the world. All right. The literature review in qualitative research is ongoing. What that means is that throughout the study, you will be engaging with the literature. Even as you begin to get findings in your qualitative study, you will often go into the literature to try and make sense of those findings, to better understand the findings, to see whether those findings have been mentioned before, because that might give you some further direction on how to continue the inquiry. Okay, so the literature review is ongoing in a qualitative study, it doesn't stop. Qualitative studies don't aim to test theory, they aim to develop theory. Okay, so often the findings in a qualitative study are referred to as theory, or they'll say theory development, right? Or they'll refer to the emerging theory. Now, they're not talking about, from your one little qualitative study, you're trying to develop a grand theory, you're kind of trying to come up with Maslow's hierarchy of needs from one little study. That's not what it means. It means that what you're developing is theoretical in nature. It's conceptual, right? It's conceptual in nature, and it's going to lead to further testing. In other words, again, developing those hypotheses is in many ways the equivalent of developing something that's theoretical. It's conceptual, right? That can be further tested. In qualitative studies, the analysis is by words and ideas. Okay, analysis is by words and ideas. We analyze textual data in qualitative research, all right? We do not analyze numbers, all right? Which is why, as I mentioned before, what determines whether a study is qualitative or quantitative is whether the analysis and the reporting is qualitative. So if you're doing qualitative content analysis, you will be reporting themes, some sort of categories, but it's all in textual form. It's not in numerical form. Of course, you do see some qualitative studies that include numbers. So for example, like this theme was mentioned 48% of the time. Okay, and that's actually just a way of emphasizing meaning, because the researcher there, they want to show that, a large portion of the sample mentioned that this was important. Okay, so it's really another way of trying to convey the meaning of the finding, that this is a very meaningful finding. Okay, so they may incorporate a few numbers, some percentages and stuff. Okay, but that's not analyzing by numbers. It's very different, okay, than analyzing by numbers. Right? In qualitative research, we don't use survey instruments. We are the instruments. The researcher is the instrument, not the quantitative survey. And I spoke a little bit about that before. qualitative studies, we go for uniqueness. We don't go for generalization. The generalization is not the goal. It's not the aim of a qualitative study. And unfortunately, a lot of our examiners in universities, they often question students along these lines. Why, how do you expect to generalize your findings from such a small sample, right? Or why don't you choose a broader sample with more breadth so that you can generalize? Okay. If you really understood the qualitative paradigm, you'd realize that that's not the goal of a qualitative study. The goal is to be generative, is to generate new knowledge, is to generate new hypotheses. It's to look at a small sample, and from that sample, generate something that could be something generalizable later on. Okay, and this is how theory develops. This is how all great theories have developed. They've started off very small, as an idea, as an initial independent finding that was then built upon through subsequent research. All right. So qualitative study, we go for uniqueness, which is why you see studies in the qualitative literature like we call n is equal to 1. What is the experience of the leader of the Ford Motor Company, the CEO of the Ford Motor Company? That could be a thesis. You're studying one individual. And in fact, even in UPM, we've had students who have done this type of study. We had one student who did a very, very nice study on the educational philosophy of a scholar named Malik bin Nabi, who was a very famous Arab scholar in education. And so he did his entire thesis on that one individual. Well, really, what can you learn from studying one individual? Well, you can learn a lot, actually. Right? You can learn a lot. But the idea is that it was a very in-depth study on his educational philosophies, right? And it incorporated his previous writings. The student interviewed his colleagues, interviewed his family members, variety of different types of data that really fleshed out the essence of his educational philosophy. Right? And for many people in the field of educational philosophy, this was an important figure, especially in that region of the world for many years. So it made a very good contribution to that literature. Okay, so the idea is for uniqueness, small samples, but in depth, a lot of depth, a lot of rich data and findings. And then lastly, rather than sampling including large samples for the purpose of generalizing across large populations, qualitative studies seek information-rich cases. In other words, we specifically choose in our sampling, we specifically choose people who we feel strongly will give us the kind of rich data that we need. Okay, so in a qualitative interview, we don't want the yes or no kind of question. We don't want people that just sit there and go, yep, maybe, it was okay. How was your experience of the program? It's pretty good. That's it. Next question. We don't want that. We want people that are going to elicit large amounts of descriptive information. Okay, and that's what's going to help us to answer our research questions. Okay, that insight, that depth. People with a lot of experience. People who are capable of articulating their experiences, right? So sometimes when we do our sampling, we have to consider language barriers. Can this individual that I want to sample for my study, are they capable of really elaborating on this topic? Do they have enough experience? Do they have the language capabilities to do it? Sometimes that's a criteria in our sample. Okay, so from this very general list, we get a sense of how different qualitative and quantitative research is. Choice of research method is dictated by the research questions. Okay, so we can ask very similar, or at least related questions in terms of research. And from those, we can really dictate or determine rather what method makes the most sense. So if we have a question, how many parents would consult their general practitioner when their child has a mild temperature? Clearly, that is a quantitative type of research question. A related question, qualitatively, might sound something like this. Why do parents worry so much about their children's temperature? Obviously, they're very different questions. One is looking for a percentage, a ratio of some kind. Another is looking for reasons. Why? What are the main concerns of parents? What are the stress, what's what role does anxiety play? Maybe it's their past experiences with other children having high temperatures. Maybe when they were a child, they had a high temperature and and it resulted in some sort of health problem. There's many reasons why a parent might be worried about their children's high temperature. Right now, during COVID-19, obviously, parents are very worried if their children get temperatures because of the current pandemic. So there's a whole slew of reasons why parents might be worried so much. A simple question yet makes a very good study, all right, especially in a particular context. What proportion of smokers have tried to give up? Okay, again, a very straightforward quantitative question. And of course, it's a very descriptive type of question. It would be a very it would be like a descriptive question for a very large, like a countrywide sample, right? And you're doing a study on smoking, and you just want to know in the past what proportion of smokers have tried to give up. Qualitatively, we may try to rather understand what stops people giving up smoking. What are the barriers, right? What are the difficulties that people face when they try to give up smoking? All right. Again, very straightforward question, but it would most likely elicit very rich findings, very rich findings. What is the relationship between smoking and parenting behavior? Okay. Again, that is a very, it's a correlational study. All right. So looking at the relationship between these two variables, smoking and parenting behavior. And of course, we could go into many related studies to that. But how do people learn about smoking? Could be another very straightforward qualitative study, right? Especially young people, right? Because we know for a fact, based on a lot of research that was initially covered up by the tobacco companies, that the tobacco companies' marketing campaigns had a lot to do with how young people learned about smoking. Okay, in the old days, they would have doctors doing cigarette commercials, right? So how people learn about smoking is a huge question, actually. And that in and of itself would have to be, that question itself would probably have to be broken down into more specific questions. Okay, but it's a very good question qualitatively. Okay, so you can see the difference in the way that we ask questions in quality and quantitative research and qualitative research, quite different. So here are some examples from real studies. So quantitatively, the relationship between types of learning activities of adults and geographic location. Okay, correlational study exploring the relationship between rural and urban adults. All right, and the types of learning activities they engage in. Okay, is there a relationship between those two? A very straightforward quantitative type of study. Qualitatively could be something like how a rural location shapes the learning activities of adults. How does where they live in this rural location with very few resources for learning, for example, how does that shape their learning activities? Okay, again, you can see how that kind of a study or that kind of a question would really elicit rich findings. Quantitatively, strategies teachers prefer to use in handling classroom discipline problems. All right. So for this one, quantitatively, we would do a literature review. We would, from the literature, we would essentially identify all those strategies that have been mentioned in previous literature, previous studies, and we would create a survey and have people tick off which ones they use or which ones they prefer. Okay, so it could be a very descriptive quantitative study, very straightforward. Qualitatively, how do teachers negotiate the resolution of classroom discipline problems? A much different study, very in-depth, because there may be so many different factors on how teachers negotiate classroom discipline problems. Okay, the rules of the school, the culture of the school, directives from the principal, for example, or the Ministry of Education, their own personal preferences, their own past or prior experiences with negotiating resolutions of classroom discipline problems, their own experiences as students in terms of classroom discipline problems. There's so many different factors that could influence this type of an outcome. Okay, so this would be a very interesting study as well. Another example, quantitative example, the relationship between being a learning organization and a firm's financial profits. Okay, again, correlational, quite clear. Does being a learning organization, or to what extent a organization has embraced that kind of approach and philosophy, does that predict whether they have higher profits? qualitatively, what are the factors or the factors that can facilitate the successful implementation of a learning organization? Okay, so again, there could be so many different factors, right? In terms of, one might be just the will of the employees. Do they really want to get into that? Because it's a whole nother way of doing work, being a learning organization. You're constantly going for trainings, you're involved in knowledge sharing, you have a knowledge management system that has to be, maintained, and so many things, so many different factors. The leadership of the organization, a big factor, right? So again, that would be a very rich study. All right, so you can clearly see the difference between the two, I think. And just some more, just to show you some example topics. These are real studies, real qualitative studies. So how certain life events trigger learning in adulthood, evaluation practices and community extension programs. Qualitative evaluation studies are very common, especially in community-based programming. Okay, so interviews and focus groups and even observations can be used to evaluate programs. Okay, and they go very nicely along with quantitative methods, surveys, pre and post surveys and stuff like that. They are used in tandem and they work very well together. Okay, so you see a lot of studies where they talk about evaluation practices qualitatively. The globalization process of private companies, how private companies become globalized, for example, and that's a very nice how study. Anytime we see a qualitative study that focuses on process, the questions are usually how based, how with a question mark. How does a company do something? How does it embrace globalization? How does it adjust for globalization, etc.? The role of HRD in successful small businesses. How adult students balance family, work, or work, family, and study. Okay, good. That would be a good study for nowadays. And some of these topics actually they come back into fashion. They become fashionable again because of what's going on in the world around us. So these topics become of interest again. Okay, so I don't think I'm gonna have time to do this, but if there's any additional questions, Dr. Dalia, are there any pressing questions I should answer now before I move on?
A lot.
Oh no. Okay, let's take 3.
Okay. Right. Okay. I'll probably will have to skim through some of the simple ones. So
Okay,
just
so you use your discretion.
I use my discretion. They will kill me for this. The audience. Right. Okay. So that's a question regarding the how we conducted the qualitative research. So for example, that we expect a free flow of information from the respondents. So but we don't really have a semi-structured or kind of structured interview. So how do we expect that the audience or the respondents will be able to go to the objectives that we highlight in the first place?
Well, and I'm going to get to this in a minute. We talk about data collection, but yes, you can have a semi-structured or even a very structured interview guide. Okay, and you can use that to conduct the interviews with. Okay, so there are really there's a continuum, a range of types of interview guides you can use. Very experienced researchers, especially if they're doing something like maybe a narrative inquiry or something, they will often use a very unstructured approach. So they may have just 1 or 2 main questions that they ask. And after that, they just let the participants tell their stories. And then they might interject from time to time, ask for more details or clarification or something. Most qualitative studies use what's called a semi-structured interview guide, where they do have a pre-existing or a pre-formulated set of general questions. And from there, they can ask additional follow-up questions if they want. But it does allow at least for prompts so that the study participants will answer specific questions, so they're not expected just to talk straight for 1 hour, okay? You also have very structured interview guides, and these are, again, for certain types of studies, they have more pre-planned questions, okay? So it really depends on the approach that you're using and the purpose of the study. And sometimes the participants, so for example, if you're interviewing very young people, you know, when we do studies with youth or young people, we often assume that they're not going to give us very elaborate answers. So for studies like that, we may use a much more structured approach where we ask more structured and a higher number of questions to help them to answer. And of course, those questions will be based on the main research questions that we're asking, as well as our theoretical framework that we're basing our study on. That will also inform the questions. Okay, so.
Right. Does a qualitative research require a pilot study?
Okay, good question. It's a common question. We don't always refer to it as a pilot study. You might see in the literature they might refer to it as a pilot study, but typically we do pilot interviews. You know, we want to first test our interview guides that we come up with. We want to test the questions that we're asking to see whether they are really eliciting the kind of data we want, the data that we need that's going to really speak directly to the research questions. And so that's really what we do when we do pilot interviews. So sometimes you'll see it referred to as a pilot test. Sometimes they just refer to it as pilot interviews, but it's really just to test the interview guide and to see how it performs. What's unique about qualitative research is that pilot data that you get. Now there are some differences of opinion about this among scholars, but that in most cases they agree that that data that you get from your pilot interviews can also be used in the findings. So, you know, so there's no strict rule on, oh, this is a pilot test and this data, it cannot be used other than for validating your interview guide. And then you have your regular sort of field test or whatever. It's not so clear in qualitative research. So many times people will use the pilot data as well for their findings.
Okay, I was about to ask that question as well, because for quantitative pilot data is not supposed to be combined together, right?
That's right.
For the actual data, right? We have a question from the YouTube actually. What about implementing an experiment? Is it a mixed method or a qualitative method?
Experimental studies can include a qualitative component. I've seen this. I mean, most of the time, usually experimental studies are quantitative, but there are mixed method experimental studies as well, where they do incorporate qualitative interviews, for example. So they may do their experimental quantitative testing of the experiment to see whether it worked or not, it was effective or not. And then while they're going through the process, they might also interview, or at the end, they interview the experiment just to see what the experience was like, to get their feedback, stuff like that. So you see that it's quite common, that mixed method design where they incorporate qualitative research into experimental studies. If you scan the literature, you will find, I think, quite a few studies that incorporate that design.
All right. I just take one more question from the YouTube.
Last one.
Yeah, because it looks quite simple here. Is a focus group acceptable for master's or PhD research?
Focus groups, I mean, technically they are, but they're, if you're going to do focus groups, make sure you do enough focus groups. And of course, you can usually strengthen your focus groups. You can strengthen the trustworthiness of the study by combining them with another method. Focus group only studies, I have my experience in terms of publishing. Journals typically don't like focus group only studies, and I've had rejections from articles, even though I was involved in a study where we did a large number of focus groups. I mean, we had a total of over 50 participants when you combine the different focus groups, and despite that, the journal said they don't particularly give preference to focus group only studies. Okay, so sometimes it's good if you can combine your focus groups with follow-up individual interviews, because in focus groups sometimes there's different dynamics where in a focus group sometimes there's individuals that sort of dominate the groups. Not everybody feels safe to share all their thoughts and ideas, and so if you provide space for those individuals to also give deeper, more elaborate responses in the context of interviews, it can work as a form of a nice triangulation with the focus groups. Okay, so it's acceptable, but it has limitations. Okay, and so you need to be aware of those limitations. Okay, group dynamics can be very interesting and unique, and sometimes not all focus groups work very well in that sense, and so you might be missing important data. Okay, so but technically they're okay. Technically they're allowed.
Okay.
All right, so thank you, Dr. Dalia, and
You're
for
welcome.
the audience for all your questions. Okay, so let's continue. All right, so I don't have much time, and then this is a very, very deep topic. This topic alone can be an entire 14-week course, but I'm gonna try and touch on, these just the major points behind qualitative data collection and analysis, just to give you a taste for those of you who are not familiar with qualitative research. See if I can do it justice. Okay, so as I mentioned, I think so far, not to date, so far in the talk, I think I have at least mentioned these forms, these strategies for collecting qualitative data. Okay, so you have in-depth one-on-one interviews, right? In-depth one-on-one interviews. And you have what are called group interviews, also known as focus groups. Okay, and focus groups are called focus groups because they are group conversations with a focus. Okay, thus the name, focus groups. All right, and focus groups have been around for a long time, and they actually started off in the field of marketing, and they're still used heavily in business, the world of business, and they do some very interesting focus groups in corporations. Big companies do very interesting focus groups, and if you go on YouTube, you can find some really interesting focus groups that they do, especially in terms of product development and even politics. They do focus groups around politics. So they'll ask a group of people, what do you think of this politician, and what do you think about his speech? And they're trying to generate support for their political candidates. It's very interesting. Participant observation is where we are actually observing some kind of phenomena, some social phenomenon. It could be the everyday life of a village. It could be a training program. It could be a class. Many different ways that we can participate as observers in our research settings. Okay, so that is firsthand observation. That is not observing somebody during an interview. That is not observation. Observation is a separate strategy that you do, where you actually go to the field and you observe that phenomenon in person. Okay, so that's observation. Video. Now we have video data, and video data can be used either in lieu of or combined with participant observation. So if you can't make it there, if you can observe yourself, you can video a setting, and you can use that video data for your study. Okay, so you take video recordings of what's happening, and then you go back and you analyze the video as a form of as a strategy for collecting data. And then we have, of course, text and image analysis. So any kind of document, any kind of textual form, data in textual form can be used, and that includes things like social media, Facebook pages, websites, Twitter feeds. They can all be used as qualitative data. All right, and even images. Okay, so we can study images. We can study pictorial data and video and image data. Okay, and it's all descriptive. So whatever we're studying, it has to be converted into textual form. And so again, this is the role of the researcher as the interpreter. Okay, so when we do observations, we're not interpreting immediately. What we're trying to do at first is we're trying to just describe what's there. So from our descriptions, then we move to interpretation. But we don't interpret off the bat. We first try to describe the facts of what's happening in the setting, and then we move towards interpretation. Okay, so as I mentioned, interviews, one-on-one, in-depth interviews, a conversation with a purpose. Okay, it's very, I don't want to say laid back, but it's informal. It's not very formal. It's very informal, and they can be focused and open-ended, as I mentioned before. So you can have very focused interviews with lots of pre-existing questions, and you can have more open-ended, really just conversations. Okay, they're both considered acceptable within the method, and they often look like this. Okay, this would be more of an organizational setting, of course. This is not like going into the field, into the kampong, but this would be more of like an organizational interview. Okay, sitting down face to face, really listening, engaging in active listening, okay, to what this individual is saying, okay. So it's not formal, but it's professional conversation. Now, this is a little bit more informal. I like this kind of interview with pizza and soda and okay. Now, this could be a focus group. Focus groups can be rather informal like this. And it is actually quite common for qualitative researchers to bring food and drinks to interviews and focus groups. We want our participants in an interview to be relaxed. We want them to be, we don't want them to be uptight, to feel under pressure, because then they will be less inclined to share, less inclined to divulge all that rich data that we want. We want them to feel relaxed, not under pressure. Okay, so they are freer to share with us. Okay, so yes, you do see focus groups that are sort of informal like this. We often will bring refreshments to our focus group sessions, especially if they tend to be a bit longer. It just puts people at ease. So conducting effective interviews, there's two types, person to person and group, okay? Now, focus groups tend to be anywhere between 4 to 12 people. That's a generic rule. That's not a hard and fast rule. You can also do what are called very small focus groups, sometimes just 2 and 3 people. Those can also be considered focus groups, all right? But what happens if they get too big is they get hard to manage. If they're too big, they're hard to manage, and you don't get active participation by members. So, that's why personally I prefer smaller groups, 4, 5, 6 people at most, because then if it's more than that, you have to really work hard to get people to get involved. You want to hear from everybody. Some people are going to be, of course, introverts, some will be extroverts. You have these different dynamics. Some will try to dominate the conversation. And so as a facilitator, you have to manage all those dynamics, and it gets to be a lot of work. And so I personally prefer smaller groups, but there are some people that are very good at managing large groups. And so it just comes with the skill level. Okay, they're both seen as a conversation with a purpose. They're not really an interview. Okay, that word interview is actually a bit misleading. It's more of just a conversation. It's, as I said, it's more informal, it's more laid back, and but it's professional. So if we have just a few seconds, I'm just going to show a couple minutes of this is what a good interview sounds like.
Allison Jones. I understand that you've taken a series of chart training workshops. I'm doing qualitative evaluations about the trainings and learn more about how participants think about their training and what they've learned. So I'd like to ask you about your experience with the chart trainings. Is that okay? Yes. Great. Can you tell me your name, please? My name is Shay Bloomer. Shay Bloomer. Okay. Can I call you Shay? Yes. Okay. Thank you. And Shay, what do you do for a living? What's your profession? I'm a nurse. You're a nurse. How long have you been nursing? I've been a nurse for 12 years. Oh, interesting. So first I'd like to start out and just kind of get your immediate reaction to the training, memories of how it felt to be in the training. What was your favorite part of the training and your least favorite part of the training? Well, I would say that my favorite part of the training was that the facilitators really took time to have discussions with us, and it was a very open kind of discussion that we had about a number of the topics that we were discussing, and I felt like I wasn't just being told things. It wasn't a one-way sort of experience. We were very much learning from one another, and it was exciting to be in a group with my peers and to be able to discuss some of the issues that we confront every day and learn different ways of approaching them. I know the training was a while ago, but I'm wondering if in these conversations that you were having with the facilitators and with some of your colleagues, can you remember any particular topic that was especially interesting for you? Well, one of the topics that we talked about taking sexual history, and as nurses who are working in HIV care and in testing, it's often important for us to take a sexual history, but it can be very uncomfortable. For example, depending on who the patient is, we have patients who come in who seem too young for us to need to take a sexual history, patients who frankly seem too old for that to still be relevant. And it was interesting to talk about how we all sort of approach it in a different way, and how a number of us, frankly, were fairly uncomfortable with the topic, but having this kind of discussion about it really helped me to feel more empowered to talk to all of my clients about their sexual history.
So I heard you say that you are now taking these sexual histories differently. And I'm wondering if, because you're taking them differently, if different kinds of information actually comes out from your consultation.
Yeah, I think certainly, because before, now that I'm more.
Oops. Okay, so I don't have time to show you much more of that video, but that's a really, really good example of an in-depth one-on-one qualitative interview. And as I'm not sure if you picked up on, but there's a lot going on there actually that that interviewer was doing to make it a good interview. For one, asking very open-ended questions, okay? Really active listening to what the person is saying, not cutting them off, making good, appropriate eye contact with the participant. And then if you notice, her questions were building on the previous answer, which shows that she's really listening to what the participant is saying, okay? The way she writes, she takes notes. You can see she's taking notes, but she's not taking too many. She's not sitting there the whole time with her head down and not paying attention to what the woman was saying. So that's a really good example. And that's what it looks like. I mean, that's really what a qualitative interview looks like. And that's a much longer video. I didn't have time to share it. I apologize for that, but just to give you a taste of what it looks like. So that's interviews. So now observations are systematic descriptions of events, behaviors, and artifacts, okay? So observations are not only of live events, they're also of what we'd call artifacts, or things that are, that are inanimate. And they can also be focused and unstructured. So observations you can do observations where you're looking for very specific things, like what kind of language is used when teachers talk to students, So you're in a class, you're observing a class, but you're only really observing the language, the interaction, the linguistic kind of interaction between the students and the teachers. They can also be more unstructured, you're just sort of looking at the general behavior between groups or something, stuff like that. So again, like interviews, it really depends on the research questions that you're asking. And there is a continuum of observation in terms of your role as the researcher. So you can be a complete participant, okay? Whereas you are, maybe you're involved in a training, you're observing a training as a researcher, but you're also a participant in the training. You're one of the trainers, or you're one of the trainees, okay? And you are also doing formal observation as a researcher. So you're actually wearing two hats at the same time, okay? Or you can be a complete observer, which we would refer to as something like the fly on the wall, right? So you're not involved, you're at the back of the room and you're just observing, taking notes, whatever, okay? So there's this continuum, and sometimes there's a mix. So we get people that are participating in some of the activities, but in other activities, they're just observing, right? So this continuum of observation, again, depends on the researcher's approach to the study and the research questions that they're asking, as well as their role, their role and their position to the study, because a lot of, for example, students, a lot of our graduate students, they like to do studies on their own organizations, the organizations where they're working, or in their communities or something. So you don't have to necessarily try to run away from your role in that organization to do your research. So you can do your study and still be a participant in that community, okay? And that's one of the interesting facts about qualitative research. In observations, it's impossible to record everything, which is why you need to have some kind of a focus when you do your observations. And so you'll have an observation checklist, or at least some guiding questions that will help you to do that, to have that focus when you enter the field. Documents are another, of course, major form of qualitative research data. Okay, so any kind of document, record, in existence prior to and during the investigation. A lot of these are sometimes historical documents or organizational documents, policy documents, etc. And you can see on the right, there's a whole list: writings, pictures, paintings, tasks, classroom activities, homework assignments, essays, quizzes, diaries is a good one, and journals are another very powerful, actually, form of document. Oral presentations, role plays, reflections. It can be artistic work as well: poems, songs, song lyrics. I mean, I've seen some really interesting qualitative research on song lyrics. Amazing, really interesting stuff. So when it comes to qualitative research, the sky's the limit in terms of what can be incorporated into a study. Especially talk about observations, documents, and interviews. You've got this huge array of possibilities in terms of what you want to study, which really makes the design very nice. So in addition, we have other ones here: historical accounts, journalistic accounts, works of art, photographs, memos, accreditation records, television transcripts, newspapers, brochures, meeting agendas, budget statements, notes from teachers and students, speeches, other case studies. And I've seen real, interesting studies on at least half of these, using at least half of these. We've even had graduate students at UPM do studies on like speeches, leaders, speeches by leaders. They've done qualitative studies on those. Really interesting stuff. Really interesting stuff. Okay, so qualitative data analysis, and I'm really trying to finish by 12. So I apologize if I'm going fast, but there's no possible way I can really cover qualitative data analysis in 10 minutes. Because data analysis is one of the most mysterious and complex phases of a qualitative study. It takes years to really learn. I would argue it takes years because I'm still learning a lot about qualitative data analysis 20 years on. But it's an interesting activity, and it's very complex. It's very in depth, and there's really no way to talk about it in terms of steps. It's not step one, you do this; step two, you do this. It's very hard to really break down qualitative data analysis in concrete sort of lateral steps. It's a very iterative process. There's a lot of back and forth. As you can see here, it is a complex process that involves going back and forth between your bits of data and concepts. You're constantly comparing, how does this data, this quote from this interview, fit within this concept that I've developed? It's that constant process between inductive and deductive reasoning. You're going back between theory and reality. The student had a nervous breakdown in class. What does that mean? What are the implications of that on my understanding of this theory I'm using, right? So it's this constant going back and forth, going in between these two ways of thinking, really, between description and interpretation. Which one is which? Sometimes it's hard to tell. Am I describing or am I interpreting? Well, description is, they walked into the room, they sat down, they opened their books, and they sat quietly. That's description. Interpretation, these are obedient students. Okay, something like that. But it's not always so clear cut. And the researcher is often forced to struggle with these two things, between, description and interpretation. So it's this kind of process that makes qualitative data analysis very complex. And many have described it as mysterious, even in some ways. But essentially what it is the process of making meaning from the data through interpretation and description. Okay, so through this combination of describing, interpreting, describing, interpreting, and then arriving at a bigger interpretation, a more generalized interpretation, those steps towards conceptualizing is really what it's all about. So going from data, from the concrete data, the specific to the general, from specific to concept. So if you look at sort of the vast majority of literature on qualitative data analysis, they all talk about essentially these three phases in some form. They have different names for it. There are, of course, it's not always three phases, sometimes it's two phases, but essentially what they all do in some form is they go from summarizing data into what are called codes, okay, where you're essentially making, you're conceptualizing at a very basic level called coding, and then some sort of combination or combining those codes into larger categories, which then eventually become larger themes, which essentially describe the entire data set. Okay, so you start off with lots of small bits of data, and you end up with, you know, a set of larger themes that really explain the entire phenomenon. Okay, so you go from the specific to the general. Okay, and that's really what the process of data analysis is all about. Okay, so coding, and I'm sure many of you who have been exposed to qualitative research have heard of coding. It's usually the first phase or process of analysis, and it defines essentially what the data is all about. Okay, so you go through your interview transcripts after you've transcribed your interviews from listening to the playback of the recording of the interview, and you transcribe and then you go through the data and you read through it, and you actually summarize those different parts of the data that relate to your research questions with what are called codes. Okay, summaries of the data, very small, short summaries. They can easily be retrieved and categorized for future comparison and analysis. And they also make it easier for us to search the data and to make comparisons and to identify these larger patterns. And that's really the goal. When you talk about conceptualization in qualitative research, what it requires is the identification of patterns in the data. So this is an example of what a transcript, a coded piece of a transcript, a part of a transcript might look like. Okay, so it's the typed text is the portion of the transcript, and the handwritten notes on the side are essentially the codes. Okay, so taking a piece of text, or a what they call a chunk of text, which would be like this one here, and coding this or summarizing this as living alone, you know. And I'm not going to read this, I don't have time, but essentially this is what coding is. Okay, so it's the researcher going through and summarizing the data from the interview according to these words or codes. Okay, and then at the end of the interview, the researcher will make a list of all these codes. Okay, and then try to combine them into larger categories. Okay, and that is where, once you begin to categorize your data, that is where the theorizing begins, because that's a form of conceptualization. You know, you're taking text data and you're turning it into a concept, right? So that is a theorization process. It's the process of developing theory. Okay, here's another example, looks totally different. Okay, and there are different ways, as many as there are many, what's the expression, as the number of researchers are, there's the number of ways of doing it or something. So depending on how you do your interview transcripts and how you do your analysis, there are many different ways of doing coding. Okay, it depends on you, the researcher. There's no convention that one must follow when you do coding. Okay, so codes on the left. Okay, so you can see in the bracketed sections here are the codes. So this text here, they're talking about close-knit community. Okay, summarized here is close-knit community. This one here summarized as health of community or community values. Okay, so these are the codes on the left. So this one page of data, according to this researcher, has 4 codes. And on the right, these are just notes, that the memos that the researcher is making to themselves about different aspects of the data. Okay, but the codes here are on the left. So from those codes, as I mentioned, now we begin to look at those codes and see where those codes can be combined and integrated to develop larger categories. And from those categories, eventually, after going through further analysis, reading back through the transcripts, et cetera, you will eventually build themes, which are integrated categories. A theme, and of course, for each research question, you may end up with a set of anywhere between 3 to 7 themes, maybe, for a research question. You can't really classify something as a theme unless it cuts across the preponderance of the data. In other words, 70 to 80% of the data in that that refers to that research question should be fitting, or should fit under that theme. Okay, so you can't really call it a theme if it's only representing 10 or 15% of your data. Okay, so themes really must reflect and represent the data that they are built on. themes should answer the research questions of the study. So for example, if the research question of the study is why do UM students undertake postgraduate study? Some example themes might be enhanced job prospects, upgrading of self, and desire to give back. Okay. So essentially that would be the result of the study, those three themes. Okay. And then of course, then you would describe, right? What does enhanced job prospects mean? Well, based on the findings, it included, 10 categories, or it included 5 categories. And then you would explain that in more depth. Okay. But the overall finding is those three themes. And these are the three reasons why basically we found students undertake postgraduate study. Now, of course, this would probably be a smaller cohort, a smaller subsample of students. It probably wouldn't be the whole student body. That would be quite a big qualitative research study to do. I might be final year students or students from one department or one program or something. Okay. Now, if I were to give you this example and I were to ask you to conduct a qualitative study of these shapes, it sounds like a very strange question. This is not text. This is not a social phenomenon, but we could do a qualitative study of these shapes. In fact, I just gave away part of the finding. What are these things? Well, our finding, if we were to do this as a study, to sort of interpret these shapes on the screen or whatever, or identify patterns here or something, we may end up with something that looks like this. We have our codes here: triangles, circles, ovals, rectangles, squares, diamonds, trapezoids, parallelograms. Okay, those would be our examples of codes. And from the codes, we would combine these according to their number of sides or the type of shapes. So what type of shape? Okay, so we could break this down into larger categories: circular shapes, ovals and circles; four-sided shapes, rectangles, squares, diamonds, parallelograms, trapezoids; and then three-sided triangles. Okay. And the overall theme of the study would be geometric shapes, because that's what's on the screen, right? If we look at that screen, it's all geometric shapes. Okay. So the finding of the study would be, what is on our screen? Our screen is geometric shapes. Okay. And then we could elaborate on that by explaining the different types of shapes according to their sides. And then from there, even give examples. We had triangles, we had circles, etc. Okay. So you could do a very simple qualitative study on many things. Right. So findings from qualitative study may look like something like this. This is not a very aesthetically attractive model or diagram, but it sort of serves the purpose. Okay, so the research question might be, what are the effects of celebration on students? So when students celebrate at the end of a semester or at the end of a class or at the conclusion of a program, what is the effect of celebration on students? And this is an interesting qualitative study. Well, the overall theme would be commitment. Okay, so what it does is it enhances, you can see here, the elaboration of the theme here. Okay, it enhances commitment through attitudes, empowerment, and student development. In other words, the narrative or the description of the theme, it enhances commitment, attitudes, and sense of empowerment and student development. Okay, so the effects of celebration on students is that it enhances commitment in these three ways. Right now, to get to this finding, there's a lot of work. Okay, so as I said before, qualitative research is the art of asking very simple, straightforward questions and getting very neat. These look like very neat findings, right? But the work involved to get to this one theme and these three sub-themes is enormous. Okay, if this is a full-blown study, it would have taken a lot of work to get there. Okay, but as you can see clearly, it is again the art of asking simple questions and getting really straightforward answers. Okay, it's the work in between where you have to really put in the hours. Okay, and the idea between in most qualitative research studies, it's a movement from description to concept, right? And this is from raw data to descriptive statements to interpretation. Okay, and this is the act of theorizing. This is the act of theorizing. Okay, and that's really what most, I don't want to say all, I don't want to commit to that, but most qualitative researchers are aimed at some sort of movement from description to conceptualization. Because again, if we're trying to make a contribution to knowledge from all this descriptive data, it has to be in some conceptualized form so that it can contribute to the body of knowledge. All right. And so this is essentially the analysis continuum in qualitative research. Okay, so I only have 8 minutes. Okay, so this will just take another 3 minutes, then we can have some question and answer. So this is a real example of a sample study, okay, that was conducted in UPM. And we've, of course, severely shortened it for you for the purpose of this talk. But the study was titled Unveiling the Possible Functions of an Outreach Teenage Health Clinic, okay? Unveiling the possible functions of an outreach teenage health clinic. Okay, so from the study, the first level coding or the open coding, the initial coding that was done on the data revealed these main codes, okay? Essentially. Pregnancy, smoking, self-esteem, misinformed, peer pressure, time, staff attributes, sexual behavior, alcohol, stress, understanding, own beliefs, venue, conducive setting. Just seems like some kind of smorgasbord, some kind of mishmash of concepts. Okay, so this is what the first level of coding revealed. Now, when the researcher, the analyst, tried to sort of further understand these codes and how they relate to each other, they arrived at these categories. All right. Okay, 7 categories. Now you'll notice the codes from the previous slide are now listed under each of these categories. So pregnancy and sexual health combined to create the new category sexual health. Now sexual health is not actually from the data. Sexual health is a new concept that was developed by the researcher, thus interpretation, okay? The description is from the codes, pregnancy and sexual behavior. That comes directly from the data. Sexual health is the researcher's interpretation. So this is where we begin to combine and blend description with interpretation. It's at the level of categorization, okay? And so the researcher interpreted pregnancy and sexual behavior share some kind of common properties, characteristics, in terms of their meaning, their definition, and so forth. So they're combined into what's called sexual health. Same goes for the others, okay? So smoking and alcohol combined, the category created was drugs. Self-esteem and stress were combined to mental health. Misinformed understanding, et cetera, okay? So from this categorization process, this analysis and interpretation, the researcher came up with 7 categories. These are new concepts. They don't exist in the actual data. This is interpretation, all right? And then from there, through secondary data analysis, which we don't really have time to discuss today, the final themes were arrived at. Okay, the first one being health issues for young people, which includes 3 categories: sexual health, drugs, and mental health. Okay, and you can see the codes are there in the parentheses. The second major theme for the study finding was barriers for accessing service. Lack of knowledge, which is comprised, as we know, misinformed understanding, attitudes, peer pressure, and own beliefs. Okay, so the barriers for accessing the health clinic are the young people's lack of knowledge and their own attitudes, right? And then finally, incentives to use the service, there were 2, availability and approachability, all right? So time and the location of the venue in terms of its availability, and the approachability of the staff and the actual physical setting. Okay, so these are the themes. So these themes arose from the integration of the categories. Okay, to get there, of course, it requires a bit more. There's more analysis that has to be done. Okay, so in other words, how do they actually do this combining of categories? Well, that's where the researcher has to go back through the data and look at different connections between the text and so forth. So, but at the end of the day, they arrive at these 3 main themes. So these are the findings of the study, unveiling the teenage health clinic usages. So health issues for young people, define the teenage health clinic. barriers for accessing service, and incentives to use the service. These are the three main issues that are of most concern to young people when it comes to the teenage outreach clinic. Okay, so this is the finding of the study. Okay? And then from there, of course, the researcher has to convert this into some narrative, right? Explain and describe what these things are, all right? Okay, I think that's perfect. We have just a few minutes left. And so I have, that's it. I'll conclude there. And now I think, Dr. Dali, we can open up for more questions if there are.
Yeah. Again, there are a lot, so I'm still not finished with the one before. Right.
So you pick the best one.
Yeah. Okay, there's a question here on for a qualitative study, can we predetermine a theory that we would like to explore its applicability? Meaning we design interview guide within the dimensions or concepts of the theory.
Absolutely, absolutely. In fact, most qualitative research studies will have a theoretical framework. And of course, there is, if you go into the literature, there's some disagreement on how much theory, what role theory should play in qualitative research, but you will find qualitative studies that are more deductive, that use theory in a much more heavy-handed way, and other studies that are more inductive. So for example, if you have, like I gave the example before of a topic that's been very well studied, there's a lot of previous research on it, there's several related theories to that topic, you cannot ignore that work, so you might start off by basing your research on a particular, but again, it's going to be used not in a way of testing, but it's going to be used for inquiry. Okay, and you can even start with pre-existing codes, that theory, so that when you go into your data, pre-existing list codes from the theory. Okay, and you're looking for data that reflects those codes. But at the same time, you're also leaving yourself open to things that might not be within that theory. So there may be new codes that come out of that interview that you also want to add. Okay, and this is how actually we make contributions to the development of theory. This is how theories evolve when you get people that use qualitative research in this manner. Okay, so you absolutely can and should, in most cases, use theory, a theoretical framework. Another reason why we want to do that is because you cannot study a particular phenomenon from so many different angles. COVID-19, student coping in COVID-19. I can look at that from the perspective of education. I can look at that from the perspective of psychology and mental health. I can look at that from the perspective of economics, finances. There's so many different ways to study that phenomenon. I cannot include everything in my study. There must be some scope, some delimitations, how I frame that study. All right. And so often it's generated from your own background, your own area of expertise, whatever field of study you're working in, or what your area of interest, and you will settle on a particular theoretical framework. So I'm going to look at COVID-19 from the, mental health coping perspective, and in the interviews, they may talk about things like finances and relationship with parents and things that may not necessarily directly relate to mental health, but you're gonna really try to make a contribution to that phenomenon from the perspective of mental health only. Okay, so that really helps us and gives us a sort of discipline so that we don't go too broad. Because if you go too broad and you try and study everything, you get very watered down results. It doesn't really make much contribution.
Right. For the audience here, just to note that I'm going to extend a bit of the time to actually allow these questions.
Injury time.
Yeah, injury time, yes. So these questions, I combined two questions actually. So for the first one is, because I think it involves similar things, that how do you bracket your emotions when you're dealing some of a very emotional kind of qualitative interviews, and there's an issue of an essence here in terms of the interview, if you have to translate it from the Malay to English or vice versa.
Okay, so I think we may need a lot of injury time to answer that first question. Bracketing is not easy. Yeah, bracketing is a very important issue in quality research. What's one of the things about reflexivity is acknowledging your own limitations in conducting a study. So that's why in a qualitative study, in your methodology chapter, you need to be upfront about your position to the study, your potential biases in how you carried out the study, what things may have cropped up. Like my student, the one I gave example before, that studied terminally ill cancer patients, a very emotional study. She got very close with her participants as well, because the emotions that were shared during the interviews really created a bonding between her and her participants. So it just requires a strong discipline to know, to realize and to know that you're in the role of a researcher. And you also need somebody else, whether it's a committee member, it's a peer, it's somebody else outside the study, to help you to gauge to what extent your emotions may be manipulating how you're carrying out the study. So for example, the questions you're asking in the interviews, how you're analyzing your data. Ideally, there should be some sort of peer examiner, not the word, peer reviewer, not peer. I always conflate those two, peer reviewer and peer. They call it peer review, not peer. I can't think of the word. It's like peer review. Somebody outside the study to give you some feedback on those things. And so I can, for example, especially if there's someone that's experienced in qualitative research, because they can tell right away from your interview guide or from your transcript, you're asking this question. This is not really related to your topic. This has more to do with your own insecurities, or maybe your own level of discomfort or something. Or, for example, the person starts crying in the middle of the interview because you've asked a question that's very meaningful to them, and you've really touched on something, but you completely ignore it and you just go to the next question. I would, if I was the peer examiner reviewer, I would ask you, why didn't you follow up with the participant at that time? And it's obviously because you are not comfortable, but maybe that's something that you might want to follow up on afterwards, because you've touched a nerve there. And of course, you don't want to cause any trauma to them, right? And so maybe that was your reason. You just wanted to, you just sort of wanted to disengage so that they wouldn't get too upset, which is fine. But it's clearly a very important topic that you need to probably find a way to ask them, maybe in another setting, or word it differently or something. Okay, so these are very important issues in qualitative research. So one is being upfront, being very transparent about how you've carried out the study, your own biases, your assumptions, being in tune to those things while you're conducting your research. So like you saw the video of the interviewer just now. So as you conduct your interviews, before question to ask yourself, okay, is this question directly related to my research question? Why am I asking this question? That is the kind of reflexivity. It's one of the characteristics of a good qualitative researcher. You have to develop those skills where you're constantly looking at yourself and how and why you're asking the questions you're asking in the course of the study. And then when you're analyzing your data, why did I analyze it? Why did I code this like this? So there's this constant interplay between you and yourself as the researcher. And that's part of reflexivity. And it's a very important principle in how you carry out qualitative research studies. Okay. So that's as short an answer I can give.
In relation to that, there's a question here saying that how extensive are we going to continue on probing the respondent until we get the answers?
Well, oftentimes they just don't have anything else to say. In most situations, you'll get to a point where they just won't have anything else to add. But again, what really guides the researcher throughout the study is the research question. So you always want to ask a question with your research questions in mind. So you always want to go back to the research question. So when I ask this question, how does it relate to the research question? Why am I asking this question? And if you have a good grasp of your theoretical framework, if you have a good grasp of what findings you've gotten up to that point, and so how is this going to further what I've learned so far in the study? How is this going to, how does this reflect or sit with the theoretical framework I'm using. Again, that's also part of reflexivity, constantly asking those questions, even during the interview. So there's a lot in an interview, there's a lot that goes on that we don't even see, because it's more than just asking the question to the respondent. It's also what's going through your mind as you are asking questions, asking follow-up questions, etc. Right? And so that's why beginners, like novice qualitative researchers, the first few interviews, they're so nervous because they're like, they got so many things going on at the same time, and they're not really listening to the people that are giving them, the participants. They're thinking about, well, what question should I ask next? What's my probing question? Am I asking the right question? And they're missing everything that's being said. They're missing all that great data coming out, so they miss opportunities to ask good follow-up questions and so forth.
Right. Okay. In the context of data saturation, yeah. If let's say the methods that we use vary. So, for example, we have done in-depth interviews, FGDs, and observations. Do you count that saturation as one or for example, or individually?
Yeah. Right. Saturation is one. There's only one saturation. It's a saturation of your findings. There's no separate findings for, well, I got interview findings, I got observation findings. They should all coalesce around the same research questions. And that's what the whole purpose of triangulation is. Triangulation is using different methods to arrive at a common, unified kind of finding, right? So the three methods are supposed to support one another to arrive at that finding. That's the whole point of triangulation, is that the findings really support each other. Now, you may find there may be different wrinkles in there, like observationally, we found something that was different than the interviews. That's quite common to some degree, because again, interviews, you're getting more of the intrinsic data, whereas observations, you're getting more of an extrinsic finding, which is more on behavior. So behaviorally, this was happening. When we asked the participants, they said this was happening. So how do you kind of combine these, or how do you marry these two things, right? And that's often what leads to more and better follow-up inquiry. So for example, like we found a difference between what the teachers did in the classroom and what they say they're doing in the classroom. There's a contradiction there. So you don't say, okay, well, that's my finding. No, the whole point of that is, okay, we need to resolve this somehow. So that's where you go back to the teachers and you ask them again and say, look, you said this last time when we observed you, you did this. Can you give us some insight into why there's a difference?
Praratif, a bit lag here. I guess the time signals that it's ending.
Well, my internet is telling me it's unstable.
Yeah.
So yeah, so it just leads to deeper levels of inquiry. Okay.
All right. So I guess the rest actually have quite a number of a few questions on how to how do you come up on the themes. Should the themes be in sentences, when we describe the themes, or how for example, do you need to keep relating back the themes to the theories that you initially started with, things like that.
Yes.
So not sure whether you can actually combine that in one answer.
Yeah, well, I mean, what's important about that is, your themes at the end of the study, don't leave your findings as themes that have no grounding in the body of knowledge. So you always have to tie your themes back to the literature and to the theory. Absolutely. So there needs to be further theorizing at the end of the study, and that's the whole point of a discussion section in a study. And unfortunately, a lot of our students nowadays, they either forego the discussion altogether, they don't even attempt it, or they only try, their discussion is limited to studies that sort of most directly support their findings. Like they don't attempt to explain those findings that are not directly supported by the literature. And that often requires a sort of secondary literature review where you have to go back and try and make sense of those findings. And so unfortunately, I don't know, students, maybe they just get tired, it's like at the end, I just want to finish. But the discussion section of a study is the most important part of the study, because that's really where you show and prove what, the contribution that you've made, that the study's made to the body of knowledge, So, and that does often require more work. It does require more an additional review of the literature. Okay, so yes, your themes cannot be completely detached from the body of knowledge and theory and so forth. You need to go back and try and work that out.
Yeah, I think in regards of students, sometimes we have some misconceptions among students where they think that qualitative study is always easier than the quantitative study. So so at the end of the day, we get a very simple discussions at the end, right? But it doesn't do justice to the work that you had done earlier. Right. Okay, so I guess that basically we have covered all the important questions that are in the chat box. So I pass it back to you, Prof. Latif, if you have any last thoughts or last advice to the participants.
Okay, no, thank you very much again, Dr. Dalia, for emceeing or Zoom seeing, whatever you want to call it. And thank you for inviting me. Like I said, I think qualitative research, I think, is very relevant nowadays, topical, and encourage people to explore it. And also exploring mixed method studies as well, mixed method designs, because they're becoming a lot more popular now. And I notice a lot more students now are interested in mixed methods research. So that's exciting too, that we're branching out into new ways of doing research, new ways of looking at problems and issues. So I think that's a good thing. That's a positive development, I think, in terms of the overall research landscape. And so that's all. Thank you everyone for attending. And I hope it was valuable in some way, some small way at least. So alhamdulillah, thank you very much.
All right. Thank you very much, Prof, for a very, very interesting sharing. So it's always good to have you on board when you're sharing things. And for all the participants, thank you for joining us. As I mentioned, try to give feedback to CADe, with the questions that we give, so that we'll be able to improve on our side as well. Some of you asked if there are any sessions like this for students, especially. You probably can also look at the webinars handled by School of Graduate Studies. So probably they will also have webinars on all these types of research and types of methods and so on. Yeah. So thank you very much again for joining us. So hope you have a very good day. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. So Prof, thank you.
Thank you, Doctor. Good seeing you again.
Okay, Prof. Thank you.
Okay, thanks everyone.
Thank you, Prof.
Welcome.
Thank you, Prof.
Thank you, Prof.
Thank you so much, Prof.
Assalamualaikum.
Thanks for attending.